some basics of the FTC Act, just very briefly. As I mentioned, it's our main statutory authority. It prohibits deceptive or unfair acts or practices. The kind of core for a deception case in our privacy and data security context is we've looked at statements that companies have made typically in their privacy policy about how they're treating information and how they're handling consumer information. And under the FTC Act, if they make a misrepresentation that is material to a consumer, then they can be held accountable for that under the FTC Act. So that's kind of been our main hook. In general, the FTC Act remedies are mostly injunctive. We can also get disgorgement and consumer redress in some cases. We do not have civil penalty authority under the FTC Act, so no fines. We do.
But of course, if you violate a consent decree after an enforcement action, then the
took
enforcement
the words
division,
right out of my mouth.
The enforcement division can get their hooks in you and can assess.
Exactly. So if you are under order and you violate the order, there's a civil penalty of $16,000 per violation, which can add up quite quickly when you're talking about millions of consumers. So just kind of to give you a little bit of a framework for in terms of the guidelines that we are looking at when we look at information security. These are some of the main tenets that we think about when we're looking at cases. Information security is an ongoing process. It's evolving. It's flexible. Technology is always changing, and we understand that. As much as possible, we try for our guidance and our orders to be technology neutral, because as soon as we specify, this is a good technology to have, 5 seconds later it will be outdated. So that can provide some frustration, I think, from the perspective of business, and we're constantly getting asked for more specific guidance, but we have to kind of toe the line for that reason.
But it is interesting that you've issued letters outside of the enforcement context in terms of advisories. For example, there was a letter a couple of years ago that suggested that companies have exfiltration software to determine whether strings of numbers were being sent in emails that might be Social Security numbers, for example. Things like Workshare or Bontu or other vendors who may be with us today. And that was very specific in terms of a kind of technology. And likewise, there was guidance with respect to the allowing employees to install peer-to-peer software at the workplace that could be used as a Trojan horse to steal personal data. And from the company's perspective, that's very useful, specific guidance. And I know some of my clients would rather see more of that than less,
right?
Rather than face an enforcement action that may be a surprise to them.
Right. Our second main tenet is that companies' security procedures have to be reasonable and appropriate in light of the circumstances. So we're always looking at data security and privacy as contextual. And again, that is sometimes met with some frustration from the business community, because what is reasonable? But it really does depend on the context. It depends on the type of information that you're handling. Sensitive health information, for instance, would warrant a much higher level of protection than some other sort of information that's very kind of tenuously related to an individual.
So a couple of points on that. I've had a lot of clients very surprised to be hailed before the FTC for an investigation, and often they're informal investigations. There are access letters, there are not civil investigative demands, although certainly you use those regularly, but most of them that I've dealt with have been through informal access letters, and they've been prompted by a breach that was in the news. And I often ask, what got your attention about this company? And the response sometimes is, we read the newspaper. The data security breach laws from the states have served as kind of a target maker for FTC investigations, in addition to things like the Wall Street Journal's What They Know series, which highlights some of the things that have been going on with respect to the use or misuse of consumer information. And what really surprises my clients is when they come in and you've asked for information about their entire information security system, and their response is, well, wait a minute, we had a breach over here in this little area, but you're asking about everything. I think you should be restricted to just asking about the breach. And what's your typical response?
Well, our typical response is that, information security is kind of global in its context, and that, there might be a breach as, pertaining to one set of information in one area of your infrastructure, but the reasonable and appropriate procedures really are applied to the entire corporate handling of information. So often our investigations, although if it ends up in with a consent order, that will often be more narrowly tailored, but our investigations can be really quite broad at the outset.
And I've actually had occasions where there has been a breach, and the commission nevertheless had decided not to proceed with a consent decree upon a finding that the entire information security system actually was reasonable, and that the breach was an anomaly.
Yeah, we do many more investigations than we do bring cases.
I was chalking it up to my good lawyering, but I guess it's just...